Okay, let us dive right into Du Bois's The Damnation of Women and dive into the issue of gender. And it's very, very important here. This is a very, very tough, delicate, difficult issue, and yet it's an issue that is shot through every week. The last thing we want to do is to think that somehow gender is some ghettoized issue. I think I've tried to note from the very first week to keep track of the way in which gender is constitutive of the doings and sufferings of any people, in this case, black people. It's not some kind of issue you just attend to one week. We've seen this with Josie. We've seen this in his feminization of black culture. We've seen this in the various tropes that he uses. But typically, often the case with we male thinkers, male philosophers, male scholars, that we rarely highlight the issue. And it's very rare you get an issue like this one essay, and that's why we spent all week on this one essay, The Damnation of Women. I thought, of course, about So She Marries. You know, that's a nice little cute kind of piece. You get a sense of his attitude toward his doctor, and I mean toward his daughter, I should say. Toward his daughter. That was quite a slip right there, though, wasn't it? It was toward his daughter. And what it is to be a father in the 1920s. Now, we want to be very clear about this. This is Du Bois in the 1920s. This is a long time ago. And so many of we men, whatever color we are, we still got a lot of challenges in 2017 because it's so very difficult, not just to wrap our minds around vicious legacies of male supremacy and the various ways in which women's potential have been truncated and foreclosed, trumped, and I'm not referring to Brother Donald Trump. That's Trump, small t, trumped, you see. And to keep the focus on the vast majority of humankind who are women. This is not a minority within a minority at all. But so easy to believe that. Why? Because the very traditions from whence Du Bois comes, the glorious dialogues that we have tried to accent in terms of legacies of Athens, paideia. How could paideia, the deepest level of self-questioning and self-scrutiny, the deepest forms of interrogating oneself, still result in such patriarchal institutions, patriarchal practices? What is it about this particular assumption having to do with women's intelligence and women's capacities and women's abilities to be something that is not an object of paideia, an object of serious interrogation and questionings? And you say, how could, in fact, these institutions valorize? By valorize, I mean edify, elevate this questioning, and yet end up so profoundly patriarchal and tied in some sense, and this is where things really get frightening. You remember what the theme was in Du Bois's The Souls of White Folk, that human hatred and human contempt and misogyny. It's not just a male insecurity in the face of women's bodies and women's potential and capacity, but sometimes it is a fundamental hatred of women. You see, the white supremacy is not always that, but sometimes it is a fundamental hatred of black people. Well, here, in fact, we talk about not the gender, the woman's question, but catastrophe visited on women, specifically black women. But of course, we have to understand this in light of the larger context. Now, what's fascinating about the legacy of Athens is what? Oh, lo and behold, when you take a look at those plays by Aristophanes and Euripides and the other, women play a fundamental role on the stage, even given the patriarchal households. What is it about these artists that trying in their own way to stay in contact with the humanity of these particular peoples, vast majority of humankind, so thoroughly dehumanized? You see. So Du Bois in his own attempt to come to terms with black women, will be carrying with him part of the legacy of Athens, and part of that legacy is always what? Profoundly ambiguous. It's Janus face. It cuts in a variety of different ways. And unfortunately, nearly every tradition that we have had access to, it could be Athens, it could be Jerusalem, it could be liberalism, it could be conservatism, it could be Marxism, it could be communism. Patriarchy is shot through every tradition. It could be religious, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, even our Quakers. I haven't spent enough time with my Quakers in the Friend's house. But my hunch is if I had a chance to spend a whole lot of time, I could tease out some patriarchal sensibilities with that silence of those courageous Quakers, the left wing of the Reformation. So it is with our Hindu brothers and sisters, with the caste. So it is with Buddhism that bell hooks and others have talked about. What is it about the very presence of we males with our insecurity, anxiety, and our fear of women's bodies? Oftentimes the response is what? Control, possession. You see. Property, women as property, bodies to exchange, bodies on the market. It could be a sexual market. It could be a social market. You see, the history of the doings and sufferings of women, no matter what color, is not a pretty history. How many have read Pride and Prejudice? You know what I'm talking about. What is Elizabeth about? Who is Mr. Darcy? 10,000 pounds a year. Mr. Bennet, all those daughters, how will those daughters survive given the fundamental role of women as property? The history of modern drama begins in 1879, of December 21st in Copenhagen. The great Norwegian playwright Henrik Ibsen writes A Doll House. I know many of you have read The Doll House. Is that right? Some of y'all read it last week because you needed some distance from the studying for your exams. I understand that. What is the dollification of women? The objectification of women, the commodification of women. When Nora tells Torvald it's time to sit down and talk, we've been married 8 years and we have yet to have a serious conversation in terms of who you are, who I am, what I feel about you. I'm not your toy. I'm not your doll. I'm a human being who has a right to a certain sense of respect and determination. Of a controlling of my own self as opposed to the way my father treated me like a toy. The way my father dollified me and objectified me, and I went from my daddy's house to my husband's house. Just another doll, just another toy, just another object for sexual conquest or other forms of conquest, or maybe even just a trophy for the male. For the male ego, all about the male ego, and that ego is rooted in such profound insecurity and anxiety and fear. Why? Because from Paideia we know all human beings are wrestling with insecurity, anxiety, and fear. And those who pose and posture as if they're above the fray, they're beyond fear, they're beyond insecurity. All you have to do is just touch their Achilles heel, find out what it is and touch it and watch them go ballistic. The way Torvald goes ballistic in that encounter when Nora says, it's time to go. I was just blessed to go see A Dollhouse Part 2 on Broadway. When they talk about when Nora comes back 15 years later, she's now a novelist who's writing these magnificent stories for women and finds out she never got a divorce. She got to convince Torvald to somehow get a divorce after 15 years because she's still what? His property. And all the money she makes from the novels are still subsumed under his name. And in a property exchange, what often happens is what? I grew up Cornelia West. But when I get married, I am now Cornelia Robinson. Because I married a male named Robinson, and I took his name. And I am now subsumed under him as, in fact, a kind of appendage, an extension, as it were. Now, of course, we always want to acknowledge, just like there's highly enlightened white brothers and sisters wrestling with male supremacy, there's highly enlightened males wrestling with male supremacy. Du Bois wants to offer himself as a candidate. Boy, isn't that courageous of our dear brother? He says, oh, I know you all are going to go at me because it looks as if I'm inconsistent. But he says quite quite explicitly here. Look at, for example, page 965. What is today the message of black women to America and to the world? The uplift of women is next to the problem of the color line and the peace movement our greatest modern cause. When now two of these movements, women and color, combine in one, the combination has deep meaning. You all see that there at the top of page 965? Because Du Bois says, look, I understand just how deep misogyny cuts in every religious tradition and secular tradition. I understand the ways in which women have been cast as property and how limited the options are. The text begins with what? The choice between virgin and prostitute. Either pure and pristine, so that the insecure male ego can put the woman up on a pedestal and say, oh, you look so beautiful from here, and I can't wait to control you when you're mine, capital M. And we'll tell the whole world, you're mine, ownership, or prostitute. You ought to be ashamed. Shame on yourself. Selling yourself. Selling myself. The history of the subordination of women is forcing them to engage in forms of exchange often mediated with the market. Is Mr. Bennett involved in trying to ensure that his daughters gain access to cash that he doesn't have? Is that not a marketizing? Is that not a commodifying? Well, it's not as raw, Professor West. Come on now, you know the difference between a prostitute and a lady. Capital L. And then you ask that lady 10, 15, 20 years after she's married, if she married the wrong bloke. You're locked in just like a property exchange. And this is before any kind of full-fledged citizenship. Women were gaining the right to vote in America which year? Somebody tell me. Don't hesitate. 1920. Big movement, 1919. What did they have to do? They had to do something that was unprecedented other than black people. They had to amend the Constitution. Had to amend the Constitution. That's at the highest level of publicness. Remember we talked about that in relation to one of the chapters in Souls of Black Folk, right? Anytime you have that level of publicness, it shows the depth of the catastrophe and the inability of the founding fathers themselves to envision a conception of citizenship. But this is just at the political level, and it's very important when you talk about gender or race or sexual orientation or homophobia or transphobia and so forth. These are never first and foremost political issues. There are existential issues of self-worth and self-respect and self-confidence. Yes, they have crucial political dimensions, but so much of the public discourse in our society wants to highlight primarily the political ones: women's rights, civil rights, and gay rights, lesbian rights, bisexual rights, and queer rights, and so forth and so on. Yes, that political mention crucial. Not in this class. The existential is always at the center. What are the conditions under which women gain access to self-confidence and self-respect and self-worth? You see. What kind of resources can they fall back on? Now, when you then dip into the history of black people, the vast majority of black people, women, what do you see? Same quest for self-worth, self-confidence, self-respect indeed, but oh, lo and behold, you've got to deal with 244 years of something that had, for the most part, disappeared in the history of Europe, slavery. But there's a reconstitution of slavery under modern conditions in the New World. And those women who get off those slave ships and are taken to the slave auction, they are not just property as women, but they are also chattel property as slaves. The chattel slavery, different forms of slavery, yes, chattel slavery. And we should keep in mind, of course, the very beginning of that process, white brothers and sisters were also enslaved from Europe. The racialization of slavery doesn't occur until the 1660s, the first flow of 1619. But what is distinctive about the racialization of slavery? Well, there's a number of things. One of it has to do with namelessness. If you actually go back and look at the records of Jamestown, when they had a slave from Scotland, Ireland, or England, they wrote the name down. And a slave from Africa, they just had a mark, no name. So invisibility, namelessness, separated already the slaves themselves. But what also was crucial was, oh, lo and behold, the white sisters who were enslaved were not put in the fields, but the black women were. Crucial difference. Slavery itself, of course, from our vantage point, barbaric, bestial, brutal, absolutely right. But already a racial difference at work within the very process, but also a gender difference at work, you see. And so the very notions of the virgin on the pedestal who is highlighted in light of what she looks like, how she appears, the discourse of prettiness and so-called beauty. That certain women are going to be chronically excluded from access to that pedestal. Now, that pedestal is not an achievement. That pedestal is still a form of dehumanization. But when you, a black woman, put in the field working along with your black brothers, there's a level of attack on self-worth, self-confidence, self-respect, a level of degradation, a level of devaluation, the level of hatred, of contempt. And of course, things get highly complicated, don't they? How come? Because these very women in the house will raise the children. Many of those children will suckle the breast, the black breast. These same women degraded, dishonored, devalued, will be the object of sexual conquest of the white brothers running things. Not just the slave holder, but the foreman, who themselves don't own slaves, but still have white skin and have a certain white power and white privilege. They're not at the top. They're middle management, that's what we call it today, middle management. They're mediating between. And there was also some black males who were foremen too. And many of them would engage in violation of black women's precious bodies. You see. So what we're dealing with is what we started this class with. The depths of the underside, underbelly, underworld, underground of modernity, and in this case, American, U.S. modernity, and keeping track of these different levels of attack. Now, for these 244 years, there's going to be various attempts to preserve family, various networks and so forth. And we've talked before about religious institutions having to go underground because it was not just against the law for black people to learn how to read and write, but it was against the law for black people to worship God without white supervision. And the role of black women in sustaining those civic institutions. The families shattered, baby born, sold 400 miles away, 500 miles away. How do you stay in contact with them, you see? Church, underground. Patriarchal leadership, males as pastors, the vast majority of the church, women. In fact, many historians of the black church call the black church a woman's movement with male pulpiteers as patriarchal leaders. In some way, that's true for the civil rights movement, too. Martin Luther King Jr., Julian Bond, Stokely Carmichael, but actually who is sustaining the movement? Go into the office and you see Ella Baker. She's the one keeping things together. Details, critiques of Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King Jr. walks the street and they say, Moses, Moses, Moses. And Ella Baker's sitting like, they don't know this Negro like I know him. Martin Luther King Jr. ain't no damn Moses. He's just a courageous, loving brother trying to do the best that he can, but I got some critique of him. That's the paideia of Ella Baker. Fannie Lou Hamer was the same way. She criticized Martin on television in Atlantic City, didn't she? When he made his compromise with the Democratic Party. She said, I question America. I question the leadership of the civil rights movement. Does that include Martin Luther King Jr.? Nobody criticized Martin Luther King Jr. He's exempt from criticism. No, the paideia of Fannie Lou Hamer. Questioning. Coming out of a tradition that Du Bois talks about in this text. Harriet Tubman. Sojourner Truth. We can go on and on and on. And keep in mind now that this is not and should never be some kind of uncritical glorification of anybody, black women or anybody. From the very beginning, we said this course is a fallible quest for truth. And if the condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, and the response to the suffering, then we have to be true to the experiences of the people we're trying to stay in contact with. And so when we talk about these various women, we're actually talking about truths that have been buried. I know the first wave, for example, of black history and black studies in the 1960s, and I was old enough to be around at that time. Very few references to black women. Very few references to the Ella Bakers and the Fannie Lou Hamers, you see. It took the courageous truth-telling of disproportionately black women and others, women in general, but then the brothers began to catch on. Lo and behold, we have overlooked something, and this is not some kind of PR bandwagon. It's not a matter of the image of the black woman. It's a truth activity. And why is it so difficult to engage in intellectual excavation to stay in contact with the doings and sufferings and efforts and failures and practices of black women. Well, you can imagine, when we look at the overarching history, it's hard to stay in contact with the women as a whole. With the Greeks, what about Sappho? Legacies of Jerusalem. What about the women in Judaism? What about those powerful voices in Judaism itself? You think Amos has a monopoly on prophetic utterance? We like Brother Amos. He got something going on. You think he's the only one? What is it about Jesus? How come he didn't go 6'6" rather than all 12 brothers and his disciples? Well, he had a relation to Mary Magdalene. She was a prostitute. She was the one right there at the tomb. The disciples got scared. Peter denied him 3 times. So much for the brothers meeting the test. Where's the sisters? They right there at the tomb. Why is Jesus hanging out with these prostitutes? I thought religion was about purity. Thank God for prophetic Judaic sensibilities that connects mess and funk with the truth rather than purity and pristinity with illusion, delusion. Nobody pure and pristine in that sense. So it was even in that third legacy that we talked about with Du Bois, the legacy of European modernity. Unbelievable enlightenment breakthrough, scientific method, romantic individualism, misogyny, and patriarchy shot through romanticism, shot through liberalism, shot through Immanuel Kant, shot through David Hume, shot through Montesquieu. My God, I thought they were enlightened, relatively enlightened. But all when it comes to the catastrophe visited on women. So it will be with the black men, Du Bois himself, you see. Frederick Douglass, the major black presence at the founding convention for the struggle for women's voting rights. Black man standing there speaking on behalf of women's rights. Rare but significant, Frederick Douglass. But he, like Du Bois, like any of we males, we carry with us patriarchal baggage. Why? Because we've been socialized in civilizations profoundly rooted, unconsciously, semi-consciously, quasi-consciously, crypto-consciously, and highly consciously with patriarchy and misogyny. You say, well, Brother West, my God, how could it be the case that if it cuts so deep, do we have any capacity at all of breaking loose? Absolutely. That's what Du Bois is talking about. But don't think that one effort or 2 efforts or a few utterances or an essay or a book or marching in one demonstration is going to do it. It cuts deep in our hearts, minds, and souls. And so when we read Du Bois, we see how honest and candid he is. Let me tell you the story about the women in my life. We know he grew up an only child, didn't know his father, marched with his mother. I was blessed just to go to Great Barrington this day before yesterday, and I just walked on the streets of Du Bois just to revel in that space. I've never had a chance to get to Great Barrington my whole life. I want to get there before I die. I might die tonight, but that's all right. I've been to Great Barrington. I went to Du Bois's house, and I could see where he walked with his mother. I can see the church that he attended. And I can see those beautiful mountains there with the beautiful foliage, you see. But he's honest. He says, you know, as a male, I didn't have a clue to what the plight and predicament has been for women. I know I love my mother. I didn't have a clue what it was like after slavery in its chattel form was shattered. And then Jim Crow and Jane Crow in the South especially, but in the North as well, but then the domestic maids. were the vast majority of black women, domestic maids, working in white households, raising white children, raising their own children in their own households, and trying to get along with their black males. Now, of course, there is a history of black lesbianism. There's a history of black women with women. There's a history of bisexual black women and so forth and so on. So we don't ever want to homogenize black women. The Audre Lordes and the others, very important voices. But it's also true that they rarely have voices that surface. And so when Du Bois talks about black women, he's primarily talking about straight women, for the most part. You see. And what does he have to say? Well, let's just turn at the very beginning here. He says, I've known 4 women. I remember 4 women of my boyhood. My mother, cousin Inez, Emma, and Ida Fuller. They represent the problem of the widow, the wife, the maiden, and the outcast. They existed not for themselves, but for men. That is one of the distinctive benchmarks of patriarchal ideology. That women exist for the male normative gaze. And women are socialized in such a way that they're told to always be aware of the male normative gaze, what they appear to be through men's eyes. What shoes they wear, the dresses. I don't know what the tops are. What do you call tops nowadays? Just tops, huh? Just tops. That's right. That's right. The dresses, the tops, the hats, and so forth and so on. You see, the male normative gaze. Are you dressing for yourself? Yes, I am, but I still wonder what I'm going to look like when I walk through so-and-so. You going to the club, you're dressing for yourself? Well, I just want to make sure I get the kind of dances that I would like. Walking through campus, oh, of course I dress for myself. Oh, okay. You've broken from the male normative gaze. Good for you. Oh, Du Bois said it's hard. They were named after the men to whom they were related and not after the fashion of their own souls. Now, I think in this first paragraph, Du Bois comes out of the blocks real strong. You know, you figure, wow, you really got a black male feminist in the making. Then you keep reading. You say, oh, Du Bois is just like the rest of we brothers. Think we so enlightened, think we making a breakthrough from patriarchal ideology, holding misogyny at arm's length. No, we don't hate women. We're not fearful of women. No, we don't have insecurity and anxiety. No, somehow we're going to treat them equally. Okay, well, let's see how you behave. And it's manifest on the page. I think one of the high moments of this text is when, on 953, he says, the future woman must have a life, work, and economic independence. It reminds you very much of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, one of the great statements of black woman's quest for freedom, autonomy, needing independence. She gets it from 500 pounds of her aunt in India. Uh-oh, there's the British Empire. What's your aunt doing in India? Where are you getting 500 pounds from India, Virginia? Yes, she's involved in the imperial activity going on there, and they're gaining access to the labor of the Indians. But I need that money for my room, because she's also rightly concerned about her economic independence. She must have knowledge, Du Bois says. She must have the right of motherhood at her own discretion. The present mincing horror at free womanhood must pass if we are ever to be rid of the bestiality of free manhood. That's serious business. That's serious business. What Du Bois is saying in part, it's very rare that a man has a level of spiritual maturity not to have some fear of a free woman. Just let that sit for a while. Because so many of you precious students are right in the age where you about to fall through that black hole of falling in love. And that's a beautiful thing. It's a wonderful thing. But will you have the maturity and the courage, right, to be willing to fall in love with a free woman? Or will she just be a certain kind of property, a certain kind of extension, a certain kind of appendage, a certain kind of trophy, a certain kind of elevated one on a pedestal? It's very much like that movie, The Philadelphia Story. You all remember that Philadelphia Story? That beautiful music of Cole Porter and Frank Sinatra and Bing Crosby, the only time they ever sing on TV together. It's musical, televisual history. But it's about, is it Princess Grace? Is that her name? You all remember that movie? You don't remember that movie? Oh, you haven't seen that movie, huh? What kind of shows you watch on TV? The Philadelphia Story? She's put on a pedestal. She's viewed as cold and aloof and detached. There's no passion there. And passion is the raw stuff of an I-thou relation, not an I-it relation. Of a woman as a subject, not just an object. You see. And the Bois is saying over and over again here, oh, this horror at free womanhood, given the bestiality of free manhood. Free men acting bestial. We've seen it in white supremacy. We've seen it in male supremacy. We've seen it in Nazis. We've seen it with a whole host of other so-called free men who are still very much a subordinate and still in bondage existentially and psychically to their egos, unable to be sensitive, and most importantly, to encourage, to affirm the self-worth, the self-confidence, and the self-respect of others, other men, other women, and go on and on and on, indigenous peoples, black peoples, and so on, trans folk, and so on. Tremendous spiritual lift that ought to come through owing to paideia, but so rarely does. What does the Bois go on to say? He says, so the world must choose between the free woman and the white wrath of the prostitute. Today it wavers between the prostitute and the nun. But what of black women? Oh, the world that wills to worship womankind studiously forgets its darker sisters. They seem in a sense to typify that veiled melancholy, whose saintly visage is too bright to hit the sense of human sight, and therefore to our weaker view o'erlaid with black. These daughters of sorrow, and yet still able in the midst of it all to muster the kind of self-worth, self-confidence, and self-respect, dealing with a patriarchal family, dealing with deeply white supremacists and patriarchal schools and patriarchal churches, and trying somehow to escape from the net of being just property exchanged. Okay. The important thing in talking about this is, like every week, to stay in contact with each level. It's easy just to reduce a discussion to just symbols. Women as symbol, black women as symbol. But the materiality of the black body tied to labor, the materiality of women tied to a certain relation to the nation state, second, third, fourth class citizenship, the materiality of what it is a black woman who is dealing in a black community under unbelievable siege, but still having to come to terms with patriarchy within the black community and outside, and gain access to some love and some sense that one can reach for the stars. Du Bois goes on to say, he says, he's at page 957. He says, what sort of black woman could be born into the world of today? There are those who hasten to answer this query in scathing terms and who say lightly and repeatedly that out of black slavery came nothing decent in womanhood, that adultery and uncleanness were their heritage and are their continued portion. But so exaggerated a charge is humanly impossible of truth. 500,000 women of Negro descent who lived at the beginning of the 19th century become mothers of 2 1/4 million daughters, 1910. 5 million granddaughters in 1910. Can all these women be vile and the hunted race continue to grow in wealth and character? Impossible. Yet to save from the past the shreds and vestiges of self-respect has been a terrible task. I most sincerely doubt if any other race of women could have brought its fineness up through so devilish a fire. So devilish a fire. You see, we turn to page 963. 963. As I look about me today in this veiled world of mine, he's on the black side of the veil, despite the noisier and more spectacular advance of my brothers. Now we need to underline those words right there. The noisier and more spectacular advance of my brothers. Even in the black context, the most visible and salient exemplars of breakthrough and progress often are black men. They circulate much more in the larger public sphere. And yet when you look beneath, and one of the aims and ends of this class has always been what? To look beneath the spectacular, beneath what is highly visible, and see something a bit more concrete. What's sustaining folk day by day? It's not the spectacle, it's the substantive. That's what sustains folk day by day. The everyday, mundane love, support, caring, nurturing of others, be they children, the elderly, be they male, female, and so forth and so on. He said, I instinctively feel and know it is the 5 million women of my race who really count. Black women are today furnishing our teachers are the main pillars of these social settlements, which we call churches. They have, with small doubt, raised 3/4 of our church proper. And he's talking to the fact that 72% of black church members historically have been women, even given the patriarchal leadership that I talked about before. If we have today, as it seems likely, over $1 billion of accumulated goods, who should say how much of it has been wrung from the hearts of servant girls and washerwomen and women toiling in the fields? The little money that they making, they still tied $1 out of $10 going to the church. They still supporting other black institutions and so forth, you see. And most importantly here, as makers of 2 million homes, these women are today seeking in marvelous ways to show forth our strength and beauty. And what's that last section? And our conception of the truth. Our conception of the truth. The quest for truth, to take seriously the lens through which black women and all of their variety and diversity, the lens through which they look at the world will change our conception of truth. This is not a matter of just being highly sensitive to vulnerable people. This is not a matter of diversity, and it's a nice thing to have variety of different bodies in the same room because we feel good that everybody is so different. Difference and diversity don't mean nothing if it's not tied to a serious quest for truth. This is not bureaucracy we're talking about. This is paideia that's at stake. This is life and death that's at stake. Du Bois understands this, even given his own patriarchal prejudices that we'll talk about. He understands this. What does it really mean to look at the world through the vantage point, for example, of the characters in Toni Morrison's Beloved, of Margaret Garner, where she kills her baby because she doesn't want her baby to be thingified. She doesn't want her baby to be thoroughly violated by white supremacists. She'd rather have that baby dead. But when she kills her own baby, is she committing murder? No. Why? Because murder legally means you're a human being killing another human being, but she's a piece of property killing another piece of property. She's sub-legal. She's beneath the legal system. She's not even able to ascribe to the human status, which is a precondition for the charge of murder. And the judge was completely overwhelmed. Well, you got one piece of property killing another piece of property? I didn't know property engages in that kind of behavior. What are you going to do? Well, in many ways, that is the case for large numbers of women of any color. It's just an extreme case of making it clear, very clear. You see, because for so long, if wives are just pieces of property, what happens when they kill their husbands? Is that murder? No, I hate to say that because I know it's on tape and they're going to say, oh, Brother West, somebody, wives ought to be killing their husbands. No, I didn't say that. I said, thought experiment. No, I'm just kidding. But what happens when a piece of property behaves in that way? Doesn't have the same human status. It's easy in 2017 to think of given the progress in relation to fights against misogyny and fights against patriarchy, that we've made so many big breakthroughs. Right? But Du Bois is making it very, very clear. Our very conception of truth is at stake. Page 965. From Black Women of America. This gaze has been withheld, and without semblance of such apology, it had been frankly trodden under the feet of men. When in this world a man comes forward with a thought, a deed, a vision, we ask not, how does he look? But what is his message? It is of passing interest whether or not the messenger is beautiful or ugly. And of course, we've seen some very ugly brothers do some very wonderful things. And we've seen some beautiful brothers who are gangsters. It is of passing interest whether or not the messenger is beautiful or ugly. The message is the thing. This, which is axiomatic among men, has been in the past ages, but partially true of the messenger or a woman. The world still wants to ask that a woman primarily be pretty. And if she's not, the mob pokes and asks querulously, what else are women for? It's male normative gaze. It's not pleasing to my eyes. What other role does she have to play? Beauty is its own excuse for being, but there are other excuses that most men know. And when the white world objects to black women because it does not consider them beauty, the black world of right asks two questions. What is beauty? Suppose you think them ugly, what then? Where does your conception of ugliness even come from? And Du Bois makes it very clear through this text over and over again. His conception of beauty is one is in stark contrast than the dominant conception of beauty in the white male normative gaze and even the white female normative gaze. You see, clashing of perspective, you see, clashing of orientation. Bottom of page 962. He says, for this to promise in their hard past, I honor the women of my race, their beauty, Their dark and mysterious beauty of midnight eyes, crumpled hair, and soft, full-featured faces is perhaps more to me than to you because I was born in its warm and subtle spell. But their worth is yours as well as mine. Why? Because conception of the truth affects all of us if we're concerned about paideia. No other woman on earth could have emerged from the hell of force and temptation which once engulfed and still surrounds black women in America with half the modesty and womanlessness that they retain. I've always felt like bowing myself before them in all abasement, searching to bring some tribute to these long-suffering victims, these burdened sisters of mine, whom the world, the wise white world, loves to affront and ridicule and wantonly to insult. So he ends up with this encomium, as it were, this salute, this praise, as it were. And yet at the same time, Du Bois, man that he is, carrying the assumptions and presuppositions of those traditions that we talked about, from Athens, Jerusalem, European modernity, and the black tradition itself in its major institutional forms of family and church, dealing with misogyny, hatred, contempt of black women, and dealing with patriarchy in the black context, and attempt to ensure that women remained dolls, objects of conquest, of control, with men in the saddle. And Du Bois wants to open up the conversation. When he wrote this essay, so many of the black brothers condemned him. And so many of the black sisters said, Du Bois, you got a whole lot of work yet to do. And when I had you read just a little brief piece on his daughter, to give you a little sense, the nameless daughter, gives you a little sense of the marriage. You see, I just read my dear sister's powerful dissertation. Oh, what a magnificent piece of work it is on singing Zora Neale Hurston. She's got this section on the Tinker's marriage. The Tinker's Marriage, one of the great plays by the great singer. The Tinker's Wedding, that's the Tinker's Wedding. And the refusal to engage in the exchange and the indictment of patriarchal marriage, which is very different than love. You can affirm love and be highly critical of a marriage that abuses and wounds, you see. And yet for Du Bois in his talk about the marriage, it is not just proud father. He's got a right to be proud. We fathers have a right to try to love our kids. But the way in which he characterizes it, and the very fact that he and his daughter married County Cullen, everybody knew that County Cullen was gay except Du Bois. And so the marriage, 3,000 people in Harlem, 1,000 people outside, tons of money. Reverend Miller, who was one of the historic ministers of the church there in Harlem, brings them together. County Cullen goes on the honeymoon with his male lover. Not a good way to start a marriage. And it's over quickly, you see. How do you stay in contact with realities on the ground in regard to caring, nurturing, self-worth, self-confidence, and self-respect? You see. And that's one reason why I had you read that piece. But we want to talk primarily about the issues of gender being constitutive in black history, black culture, and primarily the damnation of women. But I had you read that little essay just to give you a sense of how much work Du Bois needs to do, and yet he is still the Du Bois that we've been reading throughout this class.